welcome everyone to this talk. So this is part of the Electoral Regulation Research Network that brings together academics and practitioners in electoral research. And today we are really lucky to have Dr. Anthony Ware, who's a senior lecturer at Deakin, and he's going to talk about last year's Myanmar election. So that was quite an interesting one. And he has actually been to Myanmar on a monitoring group to witness the election. So he's got a really good insider knowledge of what's happened. He's also a director of the Australia-Myanmar Institute, which is a burgeoning institute with a number of scholars as well, more than 200 you were saying, and collaborations with universities as well. So yeah, welcome, and we're looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. Because it's a relatively small gathering today, we'll keep this as informal as you like. So if you've got any questions along the way, don't have to wait till the end to ask. I don't mind being interrupted. I like a conversation with people. I definitely hope that there will be questions at the end, if not along the way, okay? Today I'm speaking, you've got the slides up here, and I can make these slides available to put up with the audio recording as well. So today I'm speaking about monitoring and analysis of Myanmar's 2015 election, the processes and the result. So, I want to point out that we chose today in part because today is Myanmar's Martyrs' Day. Today is the anniversary of Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, the architect of Myanmar's independence, being assassinated in 1947, on the 19th of July 1947. So we're not quite at a significant, decadal anniversary, but so today's a public holiday in Myanmar in celebration or recognition of that. What I wanted to do today, after just quickly going over my bio so you know where I'm coming from, is to talk about the elections themselves, pop it into historical background of Myanmar, both in terms of constitution and electoral processes and elections that they have had, so that you can see where they've come from as well as where they're at, and then try to provide some analysis of the 2015 election. I just started, don't worry. Sorry. So looking at some of the concerns and issues that were raised, particularly before election day, what we observed on the ground as election monitors, and I've got a couple of quotes, and I can provide a direct link to our electoral monitoring report, if you like as well, if you remind me afterwards. And the election day processes, looking at the constitution and other limitations, obviously there. And then my particular area of research interested is actually around the peace and peace processes. As we'll get to in a minute, there are 40 armed groups in the country, 3 of which are actively engaged in conflict at the moment, and all 40 still retain weapons and territory, as well as Muslim-Buddhist communal violence, tensions that are still very, very intense. So the potential for democratisation of peace processes, normally, I'm jumping ahead of myself on my outline already, but normally, we'll come back to this at the end, normally in most parts of the world where you've got significant conflict and you're working towards ceasefire and a peace process, you achieve a certain amount of progress on that front before elections. Whereas Myanmar has actually almost been the other way around, that they're having the elections and then trying to solidify or use that as a platform for building a peace process. Opposite to what's normal anyway. So we'll come back to that later. So myself, I'm a senior lecturer at Deakin University in international and community development. My background is working for a faith-based non-government organisation in development projects, particularly interested in community-led development. But in a country like Myanmar, and all my research is focused on Myanmar, the politics and the conflict dynamics and things like that get in the way and undermine what international agencies might do in terms of good development is very serious. So political development has got to be a significant focus of research. So I'm particularly interested in conflict analysis and post-conflict development and monitoring the political transition in Myanmar, which is what's brought me here today. I've got 2 books out and a third on the way. So one looking at how international NGOs operated in Myanmar during the military period, during the period of before the 2010 elections, before the 2008 constitution actually, and then looking more broadly at how to do development in fragile, failed and pariah states more globally. I'm also, as we said, the director of the Australia-Myanmar Institute. We've got a number of institutional members there. Last year, in July, we held the largest, at that point, ever conference in Myanmar in conjunction with Yangon University on Myanmar and the Millennium Development Goals. We had about nearly 400 people turn up. We had 3 television channels come and video the opening ceremony. We had to get special permission from the Minister's office, and it was noted in Cabinet the approval to actually hold the conference and to talk about some of the things that we talked about, which included the elections and political transition, military role in politics and things like that had never been publicly spoken about in the university sector there before. In terms of electoral monitoring, the Australia-Myanmar Institute worked with what's now Union Aid Abroad to field a team to go over. We had 40 volunteers all paying their own expenses. We got to 200 polling stations on election day, which is a very small minority, but we were only one of 3 non-government sponsored organisations, the other 2 being the Carter Centre and an organisation from the EU, I can't remember now, and then ourselves as being the 3rd non-officially government election monitoring group foreign group in the country, and there were a couple of local monitoring organisations. So I personally led the team up in Rakhine State, where the Muslim-Buddhist issues have been developed, have been prominent. So the red there on the map. So to the election. Now, it's worth, putting this in a bit of context, it's worth recognising this is the first multi-party election in the country since 2010 was the first multi-party elections in the country since 1960, and 2010 Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy boycotted, and there was no transition to government except to the military-sponsored Union Solidarity Development Party, the USDP. So really it's the first multi-party election that I would suggest a transition to an entirely new government since 1960. And even in 1960 they didn't really transition. During the democratic era they really had one party that ruled the whole time. So since independence I think this is really their first peaceful political transition to a new government, which makes it pretty significant in many regards. 32 million voters, eligible voters, 93 political parties, 6,065 candidates vying for 440 lower house seats and 224 upper house seats. Actually, what I've done there, I just realised, no, they're both the total number of seats. 25% of both of those totals were automatic appointments by the military. So actually only 75% of the numbers I've put up there were up for election, and the rest were military appointees. The National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, I'm sure we all know Aung San Suu Kyi, don't we, as the Nobel Peace Prize winner, etc. She won 87% of the lower house seats that were up for election, giving her an outright majority of Parliament, and has about 3 months ago formed government and taken over the reins. She's now called the State Councillor because she was barred from the presidency, but we'll get back to that again in a moment. But she's formed government. And this is my conclusion, I guess, that we'll work through in a moment, that a largely free and fair election on the day and in the processes of actually implementing the election, but significant constitutional issues around a constitutional democracy. The election results themselves, you can see the pretty overwhelming voter. So the percentages on the right are of the total Parliament as opposed to of the vote, because we've got 25% automatically ascribed by the military there. The Union Solidarity and Development Party is the official party backed by the military, is the military party if you like. They have to be civilians to run for Parliament, so they have to resign their commission in the military in order to stand as a candidate for the USDP, which is how it's staffed, but it is effectively the military party and perceived that way. A smattering of ethnic minorities, the Arakan or Rakhine, Shan, Baol, Aung, Lisu, all picking up a smattering of seats, but very, very large majority voted for. for the National League for Democracy. So,
Anthony, when you say it's military sponsor, what does it mean? What does it mean specifically?
during the military era, they formed the USDA, the Union Solidarity and Development Association, that was kind of their civil society, state-sponsored civil society mass organisation, trying to that nominally did development kind of things in communities and social and sort of physical development activities, but was also implicated fairly heavily or fairly directly in political action against opponents to the regime. On recording, I won't go into any further detail at the moment, but there's quite a fair bit on the internet as to the sorts of activities that they are accused of, intimidations and ways to try to... Aung San Suu Kyi's motorcade, when she was released from house arrest in the mid-90s, she was visiting a number of constituencies. She was banned from campaigning. She did anyway, and her motorcade was attacked by unnamed groups of people armed with sticks and creating basically, and this was out in a rural area. Many organisations have fingered the USDA as having been behind that as a way of and then she was put back under protective custody that then led to further extensions of her house arrest. This organisation, pre-2010 elections, was transitioned into a political party that then took government in 2010, governed from 2010 to 15. Okay? As you see, the breakdown of the House, the USDP is the Green, that is the military-backed party. You've got the NLD in both upper and lower houses of Parliament. You've got the Army appointed 25% and then a few other seats. You'll also see that there were 7 seats that were cancelled due to where there were no elections, and a few other parts of some seats where elections were not held due to instability of the armed conflicts that were going. But many of the areas that had conflict where there was a ceasefire or de facto ceasefire in place did have elections, which is actually quite astounding how far across the country they managed to extend that. So in terms of background, 1937, separation from India. They were given a constitution with a fully elected domestic assembly at that point. Prior to that, there'd been a few appointees and a couple of elected places, particularly through the Chamber of Commerce and so on. Gained independence in 1948, so a 1947, end of the 47 constitution brought in, giving them a bicameral system with 4-year terms, not fixed terms. Aung San's party won the 1940 election, ready to take office as soon as independence was granted, but was assassinated in July, 6 months before independence actually came into force. So they sort of entered into independence minus most of their government, and that in some ways triggered much of the instability ever since. The AFPFL, Socialist Party, Aung San's party, governed until 1962 coup by General Ne Win. Constitution was suspended until 1974 when he brought in a unicameral one-party election system. So only members of that party were allowed to be nominated as candidates. So they were automatic winners, if you like. But the people did have a say in which candidates had a chance to vote in their constituencies. The constitution was again suspended after 1988 demonstrations. 1990 election, National League for Democracy won 392 out of 492 seats. The military-backed party at that time, the National NUP, National Unity Party, I think in English, won only 10 seats. And that's at the point that they then refused to hand over power, creating the whole house arrest and the whole mess that we've had since 1990. 2008 constitution brought in that many said was so deeply flawed that we wouldn't be able to transition to anything even vaguely resembling democracy. 2010 elections were boycotted by Suu Kyi's party. So the USDP, as it was, the NUP was renamed as USDP at that point. So 56 military appointees, 259 USDP, basically they were everything. until 2012 by-elections where 45 seats were up for election and Suu Kyi's party won 43. They did contest, were allowed to, and had 43 seats in Parliament. So you get the feeling this is really, really new kind of coming into Parliament. Certainly they most of the NLD politicians that have just been elected to run the country have almost no political experience, which is going to be a major issue going forward. Thinking in terms of the elections and election dynamics, these are the major concerns that were raised beforehand. Number one, the Constitution, and I think this is probably the most fundamental area of concern. Firstly, there were restrictions on who could become president of the country. A clause in the Constitution saying that if any of your immediate family members, your partner, your children are foreign nationals, then you are completely barred from politics. Now, she was married to an Englishman, lived in the UK, and her children are UK citizens. And many see that clause in the 2008 Constitution being deliberately designed to keep her out of the presidency. Military is not subject to government. Military gets to appoint this is by constitution, gets to appoint 25% seats in Parliament, controls the three key ministries that manage the borders, the army and the police force. A change of constitution requires a 75% vote of a joint sitting of both houses. With 25% military appointees. Unless you get the military on board, you will never change the constitution. National Defence and Security Council is not in any way subject to Parliament or to the government, and many suggest has more power than the government actually does. The Constitution gives the military the right to step in at any time to take control and suspend the Constitution by which it legitimises its very taking of control. So, in some ways, a very deeply flawed Constitution. The voter lists were an absolute shambles. Estimated somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population who were eligible to vote weren't on the voter lists. They set up a system of displaying voter lists. I mean, they haven't collected data on anything, censuses or whatever, since for 50 odd years anyway. So it was very hard to get those lists together. I'll grant them that. And I don't think it actually advantaged the military party in any sense at all. Advance lists were displayed 6 weeks out from the election in all polling station areas, and people were encouraged to come and check that if they were eligible, they were on the list, and bring documentation to put themselves on the list properly in person at those venues. However, very low turnouts. Doesn't seem to have been well publicised that was going on, or how to make that work. And interestingly, political parties were banned from actually assisting that process, particularly from bringing people in and helping them check their names off the list. Several were arrested for trying. So the whole kind of community organising that we see, particularly in US elections, bringing people out to vote or making sure they're on the rolls in time, that kind of thing, was actually illegal in Myanmar's election, which is probably one of the key reasons for major disenfranchisement. And even then, just the complete lack of organisation meant that a lot of the corrections that were nominated weeks out from the election were not actually implemented. So when people then turned up on election day, having been checked they weren't on there, provide their paperwork, to have them themselves on the electoral roll in time, still weren't processed, and they were not able to vote. So big problems there. Approximately 20% of the eligible voter population were unable, or that technically should have been eligible or were eligible in the 2010 elections, were unable to vote. So migrant workers, both abroad but also particularly internal migrants and people who had been displaced by conflict and so on, they had no mechanisms to allow those people to vote, even though they were eligible voters by law. Monks and religious leaders by constitution are not allowed to vote. So if you're a paid religious worker of any religion, or supported, if you like, through a monastery system, then you're not allowed to vote in Myanmar. Their idea of separating religion and politics. Certainly the Rohingya, as a major ethnic group of probably 1.3 million people, were allowed to vote in the 2010 elections. They have residency papers, if you like, there's been a massive dispute about their eligibility for citizenship, and whether there's questions about their eligibility or whether there's questions about the process of implementing laws around their citizenship. But due to the Buddhist voting bloc, laws were put in place that removed... Initially, the initial announcements of the election said that they would have the vote. And then when the Buddhist nationalists complained loudly, that was then revoked, and they were removed from voting eligibility as the laws passed through Parliament. Most Muslims were barred from standing by the Union Electoral Commission. It's the UEC, sorry, not UED down there, I'll get to that in a minute. And very few women were endorsed as candidates. That's both through the parties but also through the UEC, who vetted every candidate and said whether they were going to be allowed or not.
So
now,
why would the Muslims fight? Is there a law against Muslim standing? Or?
No, not formally, but,
Yeah.
but take a look at this. You know, the Union Election Commission, UEC, chairman was a former senior member of the USDP party, there were a lot of questions raised about his impartiality. I think actually he did lead quite an impartial campaign on the whole, but some of the questions raised, every candidate nominated then had to be approved by the UEC, who didn't have to provide reasons for their barring of particular candidates, and it's not clear that it certainly wasn't open and transparent. It was not clear it was necessarily rule-based. That election broadcast speeches, even speeches in party offices, had to gain approval ahead of time, had to submit a script of what was going to be said ahead of time for approval by the UEC prior to being allowed a week or two's, so censorship effectively, or the potential for censorship, in a relatively non-transparent process. I think they were very worried about civil unrest and the insurgent groups taking advantage of it. I think that was probably their motivation, thinking as generously as I can. But it certainly smacks of censorship and control in the lead up to the election. Freedom of expression, certainly there were a number of arrests of people making jokes about the military and the military-backed party on Facebook and then being arrested for it. Any protests against the process and the military-backed party, there were quite a few arrests. Any campaigning without authorisation, again, there were a number of arrests. So these are the sort of issues that were identified in the weeks leading up to the election. Polling day itself, and I know there's a lot of text there, I don't plan on reading it all, but I'm sure you can skim over that with your eyes pretty quickly. So this is cut and pasted straight out of our report from our election monitoring. Minor irregularities, and lots of them, including, you know, special election police at polling booths, armed police and soldiers standing outside polling booths, but never inside with weapons that we identified. Police actually being inside polling booths on occasion when technically the law said they were only allowed in if there was an incident they had to go in for. Extra people being behind the the voting cubicles. I actually witnessed one election official going in there and helping someone fill in their form. Now, it was an elderly person. I'm sure it was intended as just helping them, and I'm not saying there was anything wrong with what was done, except it was, it's not the way the law set up and best practice. No reports of harassment, intimidation, none of the biggies, but lots of little things. Okay. Conclusion from that rundown, as I'm getting towards the end here, is that I think the process is on the day, and I'm very happy to talk about my experiences on the day in more detail. We're a bit chaotic at times, like a lot of officials, and most of the election officials in the booths were school teachers who'd been employed. This is the first time or second time they've been employed around elections. So there's a lot of people that were kind of learning their way with processes. It's not something they've got a strong culture of. But I think they were generally sound in what I saw and what we saw as a team. And we tried to make sure that we got out into some of the conflict areas and some of the less, the more likely for things to go wrong sort of areas. But it was the structural issues, particularly constitutional issues, that really undermined democracy in Myanmar and the electoral process rather than the implementation on the day. Quickly as I finish up, and then we've got plenty of time to discuss the implications of the election on conflict and peace on the election. Myanmar, unlike, probably more than most other, just about any other country I'm aware of, has really politicised ethnicity. From day one, the upper house from the 1947 constitution on is a chamber of nationalities. So while we have a state-based system in Australia of voting for the upper house, that differs from normal constituencies. In Myanmar, it's an ethnic-based, it's a race-based constituency. And so it's a chamber of nationalities that uses a non-proportional system, but a system nonetheless that's different to the lower house electoral zones, but deliberately designed to get ethnic kind of a representation into the upper house. As I said, 40 armed groups, almost all of them are ethnic or race-based groups that are fighting for some form of limited autonomy in their region or some kind of control of the politics and some of the decisions of their own future, arguing that they have been actively discriminated against by the Burmese and by the military for a very long time, and they still control or project their power over a large enough part of the country. As I said, the Muslim-Buddhist communal violence. So we've got a process underway in Myanmar, a peace process that has been trying for the last 3 or 4 years to get everybody together around a table, negotiate a national ceasefire with the armed violence. We've got some relatively new processes trying to get the Muslims and Buddhists to talk about a shared kind of a future in Rakhine State. As I said at the start, it's most common that in most conflict-ridden societies, think Northern Ireland, think the former Yugoslav states and so on, that we arrive at a peace deal and then we solidify that peace deal through the election. So a lot of the negotiation then is about power sharing and devolution of power, federation, or some ways of representation that then allows that to sort of the armed conflict or the ethnic communal violence to morph into a legitimised political struggle in an institutionalised sense, so that you've got institutions of state that then allow that contestation in non-violent forms. Whereas in Myanmar, they've had the election that has seen a good number of ethnic minority politicians and some ethnic minority parties elected into parliament, while there are ethnic minority armed groups that are also fighting for legitimacy. In some ways, we've multiplied the number of actors with some form of legitimacy to their people, and probably complicated the process now of who ought to be negotiating some peaceful outcomes. The elected representatives from those regions, or the armed groups from those regions, or civil society actors from those regions, and it's probably in some ways become messier going forward. It certainly raises a lot of questions, and it's going to be quite a messy process going forward. There is a risk that the armed groups now feel that the election process has delegitimised them somewhat. A ceasefire with a 3, 5, 10-year negotiating period is always bad for a rebel group, if you like, because their recruitment, the financial support that they get, the support of community members, is usually driven by the fact that they're perceived to be doing something for the community. And sitting around a table having relatively behind closed doors discussions usually means that their financial flows and their other forms of support dry up. All the more where there's now going to be a range of other actors that are brought to the table. So it's going to be a very complicated time going forward to try to, and especially when you've got a government that is one party now has a government in their own right with a very large percentage of the vote. The ideas around power sharing, ideas around devolution of power, ideas around federalism and decentralisation to state governments that may end up being dominated by these groups, if these groups are allowed to also contest, may become major complicating factors, but I do think that's significant to the way forward. So with that, I'm going to pause and allow questions. I think I've probably covered a whole bunch of ground, but there's probably got areas of your own research interest and other interests that you'd like to probe a bit further. So over to you.
Thanks very much. That's really fascinating. My question, I guess, is what do you think the Army's game is? What are they trying to achieve? I mean, you talked about the various safeguards. You know, they've got 25% of the MPs. They've got control of key ministries. Why do they want that? Are they just protecting their jobs? Are they protecting themselves from, prosecution for human rights abuses? Or are there particularly policy goals that they want to promote that they're afraid the elected government might not?
I think,
what's the object?
I think the two things that you've said are definitely in play. They definitely don't want to end up getting arrested and prosecuted. They definitely want to protect their position in society, in at least an economic control perspective, if not a political control perspective. And many of them have made a lot of money through the years. That they've been in a powerful position. So they've moved from being, in many cases, rank and file, just relatively poor families 60, 70 years ago to now being the elite in the country. And they want to protect that position. I think there's no doubt in my mind about those things. But I think there is another side that we often miss. We often sort of see military dictatorships and militaries involved in politics from a very negative light and assume it's all about power and it's all about control and it's all about economic and personal gain, and downplay the possibility that there is actually, at least in their own eyes, almost an altruistic perspective, that they believe that they can provide a better protection to the state and they consider democracy, at least unleashed immediately, to be very dangerous for risking the disintegration of the state. And I think they honestly believe this. I suspect it's probably not uncommon globally, actually, even Turkey in the last few days and so on. Yes. I think while I don't in any way endorse, military rule anywhere in the world, and I think it's such an abuse of power, the history of the Burmese armed forces, they came into existence under Aung San. Aung San Suu Kyi's father was one of the creators of the army. Yep. And they came into existence during World War II as part of their struggle against the British colonialism, trying to gain their independence. And so there'd been a very strong nationalist struggle. And in the lead up to World War II, they, with much of Asia, saw the Japanese as being potential liberators from colonialism. They smuggled out, at the early part of the war, they smuggled out the 30 comrades to, which is interesting, comrades to Japan. Ignore the politics and the confusion about which side of politics who represents. They smuggled out their 30 comrades to, that really were from the Communist Party, that Aung San actually founded, to Japan for intensive military training, and they then led in the Japanese troops. So there were two major invasion columns into Burma, and at the head of those were 15 each, I think, of the 30 comrades. They recruited an army that, if memory serves me correct, before they got to Yangon, so about 100, 150k advanced by the Japanese, they had recruited an army of 30 or 40,000 soldiers. Okay, armed by the Japanese, because the Japanese were the liberators, and they were coming in as and they were recruiting those to liberate from the British. So the army was created with a political identity, not as protectors from an outside force, but protectors of. And they've made this clear from day one that the ethos of the army has been to protect the state effectively against two things, although they put it down as three, against the disintegration of the state through the ethnic dispersion and separatism, and from subjugation to foreign powers. Okay, that's what they were there to protect. They halfway through the war decided that the Japanese were worse than the British, sent messages out to the British and basically said, we will switch sides, and did so. And overnight, the entire Burma army went underground in one night, to the complete surprise of the Japanese, took up positions against the Japanese and fought the British back in, on the proviso of independence. And so they were probably the first post-war country to gain independence from the British. and immediately left the British Commonwealth because they did not want to be subject to. They joined the non-aligned movement. In fact, they were one of the key initiators of the non-aligned movement globally. And this ethos of not being aligned and not being part of the Cold War machinations. When Chinese nationalists, most of them went to Taiwan, but some of them went to northern Burma in Shan State, and unbeknown to the Burmese, the CIA were helping train them. I think that's quite well documented now. Helping train them and arm them. Burma went ballistic over it because they didn't want to be aligned on either side. And support either side. So they've had this really almost xenophobic kind of an idea about non-alignment and not being controlled. And that has really come from the... So this has been a consistent from 1942 onwards mentality driving the rationale for the army. And of course, the West, we didn't object to it. In 1962, when General Ne Win led his coup, and that was an era where there was a growing assumption in the West that democratisation probably needed a period of stabilisation under a firm hand first to get to a stable, independent country after colonialism. And it was quietly celebrated. And we quite happily did business with them until 1988. Yeah. So this has been their ethos all along. I don't think, in fact, 1988 was all about, initially, the dictator, if you like, arriving at a conclusion and making recommendations to his party that they transition to a liberal economy, a multi-party democracy, and he resigned to pave way for the dissolution of his one-party state and a move towards a multi-party, liberal democracy. And his party and the army said no and ran an internal coup. Again, they felt that was far too threatening, particularly in the light of 40 armed groups and the possibility of it tearing the country apart. And then, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi, who hadn't spent most of her life in she might be the daughter of the hero, but she hasn't spent most of her life there. Whereas those who had been alongside the hero all his life, or the next generation to come through, protecting the country, living in the country, now comes the daughter, who's a woman, who's been in the UK, accepted all these liberal values. Where's she been? Who didn't bring her children up, didn't register her children as Burmese citizens. Now she wants to come back and stand up as the figure. But is this going to bring in a form of neo-colonialism? And I think that really scared them in a really genuine way that we don't always give credit to. So I think that's what's driven them. And I think progressively they've come to relax a bit more about her. But they need to be, in their own mind, they've got to be guardians for another 10 years or more. If we can solve all these armed conflicts, if we can settle all of this down, if we can create a unified country going forward, and we're confident of the ability for the government to maintain independence, I suspect if they can protect their own wealth and their own position economically, they'll pull out of politics. Or at least they're not going to pull out of politics until that. The first chance to get them out of politics will be then, not now.
And how much is, on that particular point, how much is a sort of rationale based on state-led development underpins, this argument for military dominance?
Well, 60s and 70s and even the 50s was very much state-led development. There's no question about it.
Is it explicitly the case? And they're saying, look, I mean, is it explicitly the case, and is it somehow influenced by the socialist beliefs?
It was very much a socialist state. The BSSP, who won the one-party state after 1974, was the Burma Socialist Program Party. And they had their 3-year plans and their 5-year plans continually. And so it was very much a socialist ideology. They dropped socialism after 1988, after that coup happened. And so they've dropped socialism as an ideology, although really they didn't know any other way, I think. I think they were attempting to liberalise the economy, but not liberalise politics until things died down. But of course, Aung San Suu Kyi never allowed things to die down enough for them to liberalise politics for quite a long time. But I think that was in their plans after 1988. Certainly the ambassador at the time, who was actually an adjunct here at Melbourne Uni, I was just having morning tea with him this morning, but he was the ambassador during 88 to 90, and he said that his interactions with that new regime, he's absolutely convinced that they wanted a liberal democracy, that even the new faction wanted to safeguard that transition, but they wanted to move down that path genuinely, at least until Than Shwe gained ascendancies in 1993. Which is interesting because it's not the perception, it's not what they actually did, but I think they were reacting out of fears in the same sort of way. So state-led development, I think they did that up until 2010 without meaning to. From 2010 though, the newly civilian President Thein Sein, who had been one of the top 5 under the military junta, but when he was elected, at least nominally, in the 2010 elections, I think he took a different tack than people had expected, than the military had expected, and led to a lot more liberalisation than he thought. And so there is a very high degree of cooperation now with the international community, with the World Bank, the IMF, particularly, well, not so much the IMF at the moment, but definitely World Bank programming and loans programs with the UN agencies, a very high degree of cooperation, and it's not such a centralised, planned economic kind of growth now at all. It very much is a neoliberal capitalist kind of an approach with as much, with a measure of control and a lot of difficulty, a low capacity and a lot of difficulty doing business. So it's sort of evolving slowly.
Yeah. Can I ask the flip side of Charles' question?
Yes, yeah, and then we've got another question here. So don't forget your question.
That's right, exactly. What's the NLD's game plan?
What's the NLD's game plan?
Yeah.
What's any political party's game plan?
Yeah.
Win, and win big, so that we've got a very clear mandate to get on with change. In the nicest possible way, let me say that for the right motives and with the right ideals, I think Aung San Suu Kyi has been just as intransient, just as dogmatic, and just as headstrong as the military regime have. She probably needed to be to get through this last 20 years, but in the same sense, that has tended to be very confrontational. And probably inadvertently prolonged the period, given the sort of reactions that the military had to that level of confrontation and provocation from their perspective. So what's her game plan? She is a very ideologically driven, and I say she because she really is the person of the party, which is a bit unfortunate because there's not a really broad depth of democracy and of policy process, etc., in the party at the moment, I don't think. Something they've really got to work on. Yeah. But their game plan is to get power and win power and retain power, like every political party. Her ideology is very much the sort of things you and I would fully agree with, although she is also quite nationalistic, and I guess that's what, in some ways, that's what the country needs, as long as it is Myanmar nationalistic, not Burmese ethnic nationalistic. And I think she's halfway in between on that. So as long as she can unite the ethnic minorities, and I think she's serious about it, but I don't think she's quite fully aware of just how nationalist ethnically she comes across to many of them. So she's got a way to go to win them over. But yeah, their game plan is to win power and stay in power forever, as every political party wants to do.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I know nothing about Myanmar, but I can remember at the end of the Second World War in 1945, the British Labour government, which was the first one, always had a policy of liberating the colonies, and they immediately started to do that.
Yep.
Some people say they did it too fast. India, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Burma. Now, they always tried to leave behind democratic institutions.
Yes, they did.
They didn't always last. Elected governments, independent judiciaries, independent public service, etc., and that sort of thing. Now, Myanmar seemed to fall behind the other colonies in this area, India, Malaysia, and so forth. I remember at one stage they were considered a closed country virtually.
It was probably more after the 62 coup that they went to get very closed. I think in the 50s that wasn't the case. That was quite open, and there were a lot of consulting firms and government to government, support and advice around development and so on. But I think the question about why they fell behind politically and economically so quickly, I think there's 2 points to that. Firstly, in many regards, Burma, most of its colonial history was a colony within a colony. Burma was part of British India. It wasn't a British colony of Burma, it was Burma within British India. And so they had a few seats in the Indian Parliament, but historically they'd never been a part of India, and it was kind of a very artificial construction. It wasn't until 1937, and of course the war broke out in 39, and they were invaded in 42, that they actually gained their independence from India as a British colony direct to London, as opposed to via the governor in India. So the governor in India really had full authority over them in the same way that London had over India. So I think the building up of democratic institutions as a colony or country in their own right had such a short history that it was not at all well grounded, firstly. I think also the second point is that Burma was the most war-damaged country in the Asia-Pacific area because they were fought in. I mean, Thailand surrendered, etc. But the British and the Burmese, and some of the ethnic groups in Burma, the British decided to make a stand in Burma and fought really quite hard. So infrastructure damage across the country, railway lines, bridges, etc., almost a total annihilation. Roads potholed and almost impassable, etc. And then having the Japanese got in and begun to try to build the Burma Railway and actually set up a little bit of infrastructure, then the Burmese changed sides and helped the British fight their way back in, and a second round of fighting damaged retaking the country. Yeah. And because they left the British Commonwealth so quickly, they missed a lot of the other repatriation funding that within the Commonwealth that the likes of Malaysia got. And they devolved into civil war very, very quickly afterwards as well. Partly because some ethnic groups had supported the British and some ethnic groups had supported the Japanese during the war, and so there'd been ethnic group on ethnic group fighting within the country, and some horrible massacres that really are the foundation for much of the armed resistance ever since. And certainly there were two groups who rebelled against the new government months before independence. Before the British actually left, there were already armed insurgent groups, and within 6 months, 80 to 90% of the country had fallen to a hodgepodge of different armed insurgent groups, and only very slowly did the government regain control. Even parts of Yangon, Rangoon, were under rebel control for a period after that. So while the government remained open for the next 14 odd years until 1962, they were in a mess. And the third thing I should say is that a reason for them to fall so far behind so quickly is with the war looming, a very large number of the wealthier, better connected classes of both Indian from the British India period, Westerners and locals left. And many of them had intended to go back after the war, but then with independence and the chaos that was ensuing, never did. So a lot of the money, a lot of the expertise, a lot of the infrastructure, if you like, the civil structures that they might have otherwise left behind, the know-how in people's heads was no longer in the country.
Yeah. They've struggled, haven't they?
They really have. They really have.
Really struggled.
They really have. And while, before the war, they looked like a country that was set for, in the terminology of the day, take off economically and politically, they never did. And sometimes that's just labelled, that's just landed at the feet of the military. Military didn't take power till 1962. And I think really it was the war, it was the Civil War, it was the leaving the British Commonwealth, and just the mayhem. And leaving too quickly, all of those sorts of things. Yeah. But the population were demanding to leave.
Did they leave the Commonwealth too early? I know it's easy in hindsight. As you know, Malaysia, the British stayed there till they defeated the Bounders. So
yeah.
Although they've had relation messes, they've done quite well.
Yeah, exactly. You look at
it's
Malaysia, you look at
hindsight.
Singapore, and you wonder whether because Rangoon was the Singapore of the time. Yeah. In terms of the trading hub, everything else, and the British probably would have quickly rebuilt that as that. But hindsight's easy, but there's certainly been a mess of a history, unfortunately. So look, I think if there's one thing out of all of talking about that mess and so on, the capacity for government. We've got a fantastic new government of complete novices. With 25% military appointees. a mess in terms of ethnic conflict. I mean, it's not even just one or two you've got to negotiate with. You imagine, even if they succeed in getting a national ceasefire in place, which she had meetings 2 days ago about that are looking fairly favourable and may well be able to achieve. Certainly, everyone's hopes are sky high at the moment that she will get a national ceasefire in place. When I say 40 armed groups, 20 of them already have some kind of a peace deal, but that still involves them holding guns and territory. But to get all of those sort of players around a table to come to a common agreement is going to take a lot of effort, and these are relatively complete novices. In a country that, because of the long military history, many people who had an opportunity to leave have. Education in the West, Colombo Plan, educated, you name it, and they've migrated. We've got a large Burmese population in Perth that have moved out over the years. More recent migrants have come to Melbourne and then Sydney. Melbourne's actually been the preferred destination from some of the ethnic minorities. But Perth, in the early days, after the military and during that mess, there's a big Burmese community that have been there 50, 60, 70 years. The massive brain drain and economic drain that caused. It's going to take a while to reverse. To get on a sort of bootstrapping, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Not easy.
So do you think is Aung San Suu Kyi going to rely on the expertise of the military and the military people to some extent, simply because they're the ones with experience?
Well, she's actually been very conciliatory, I think, in a positive sense. Certainly had some positive-looking meetings. They certainly saved the best education in the country for the military. Right. So the military officers are often, in the younger generations, are the best educated because their education's been better resourced. Most of her party senior staff are ex-military generals who happen to fall out of favour with the ones who are in power. So again, is her party less military? Well, it is now in terms of the MPs because there's so many who aren't. But in the earlier days, and certainly even back to 1990, those who rallied to her in the 1990 elections were almost all military people who fell out of favour with a particular military faction in power. With a military the size of Myanmar's, it's almost impossible to separate out military and non-military. But I think she's very keen for this not to be foreign-controlled development, politically, economically, but also to cooperate really, really solidly with the international community, but under their leadership. So there is there were before her election, but also since. Quite a number of meetings where the government has tried to take control of the development agenda, not in a government-led, like you were talking about, a developmental kind of a state, but in a sense of negotiating the terms by which international agencies come and operate so that it coordinates with the state well. If that makes sense?
Yeah.
And bring coordination, cohesion, in ways that are actually described as best practice in international development sense. Not ways that are in any way problematic,
So the foreign aid, like there's IMF and World Bank.
World Bank, IMF, I don't know that IMF actually restarted because they're obviously about loans and Myanmar's got low capacity. But World Bank, with concessionary loans and so on. Look, the Japanese loaned $1 billion recently, 700 million and gave 300 million 2 years ago. I'm not sure what they did last year, probably more again. There is very significant investment and aid going into the country, and that will grow despite Australia sort of being the laggard in all of that. So it will be, yes, it'll be military. There's also been a pretty fair appeal for Burmese who have been 20, 30 years in Australia, in the West, certainly those who left after 1988, to return with their education, with their experience, and bring that back to the country now. And there's a fairly large community that have done that. Many of them are finding it difficult to reintegrate or to be accepted back. There's those who have suffered for 25 years, and now these guys who fled and had an easy life for 20, 25 years are coming back, and they're suddenly the heroes. What about us? So there are some internal tension dynamics around that. But I think she sees a combination of young people who are coming through a new era. Stepping into significant roles quite young, people coming back military people who are prepared to cooperate. Yeah. Hopefully a real consensus building kind of an approach. So overall, I'm quite optimistic as long as we keep a realistic time frame. I think if we expect that a new NLD government is going to hit the ground running and in 3 years or 5 years is actually going to turn everything around, I think we're kidding ourselves. There's such low capacity, there's such inertia to overcome, there's such a deficit of know-how, there's such a lack of systems of every kind, and I think the shambles with the electoral rolls just highlights that. That there's so many systems and structures got to be put in place, even if people have the best of intentions and are genuinely trying to do a really good job to get to that place. And so many obstacles like the Rohingya question about their ethnicity, about their ability, to, their eligibility for citizenship, and how to defuse those ethnic, religious type tensions, communal tensions, and then the armed conflicts. So they've got massive problems to overcome. And all the while, the military is going to be sitting there, putting the handbrake on the moment they think there's any sign of danger.
Just ask, the ethnic Burmese, what proportion are they of the total population?
I think it's around, I did know this off the top of my head. I think it's around the 60% mark. But the ethnicity figures and religion figures from the most recent census haven't yet been released, probably in the next couple of weeks, and they'll be quite reliable. Before that, we're going back to 1970s, 1980s partial censuses and predictions back from when the British were there, or because it's been such divided and conflicted countries. So, yeah, estimates vary very wildly. Before the total population figures that came out, some government departments in Myanmar were overestimating the national population by up to 10 million people. So that's how much data they don't know about in the country.
Sorry, just one more. I think you're talking about how although the election day was there was inefficiencies and so on, but basically pretty good.
I think so.
But the lead up to it, the whole campaign was very tightly controlled and not really modern democracy at all. Do you think that will improve by the time?
I'm sure it will. Personally, I'm sure it will. I think the intent. Now, people often accuse me of being a little bit too positive on Myanmar and the previous government and so on, in terms of their motives and intentions. I subscribe to really trying to get inside other people's heads and trying to see the best possible motive people have for an action or something, rather than jumping to the worst possible motive conclusion, and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But with that in mind, I do think that the Union Election Commission and the previous government had the best of intentions, that they tried really hard and overall did a very, very commendable job. And we'll learn from the mistakes, if you like, that were made. They were actually incredibly open, particularly at the official top level of the UEC, like the AEC, in granting access to monitoring organisations and in accreditation. It was cumbersome and slow to get registered, but the actual access granted was as good as anywhere, I think, and better than many parts of the world. I think they've got a very genuine desire to do elections as well as anywhere in the world. I'm not so sure that they're yet ready to amend the constitution and the structural issues behind it, but certainly in terms of election day processes and the lead up. I think the controlling of media and speeches and things like that, personally I think that was a fear that of social disorder, of campaigning leading to Buddhist nationalistic kind of outcries and outbreaks and mass things on the streets and things that could threaten the country, and I think they had a real fear of that and wanting to just keep a lid on anything. There were no reports of political speeches that went through a censorship, if you like, by the UEC being told they weren't allowed to say certain things. No reports of things being crossed out and you're not allowed to say that. But everything had to be submitted 2 weeks in advance or a week in advance to give a political speech, depending on the context. So it looked and felt like there was censorship going on, but there was no indication that anyone was told, no, you're not allowed to have this, you're not allowed to have this rally, and you're not allowed to say those things. So I think it was done with the best of intentions, and I think that they will learn from it and they'll gain some real skill in handling it.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. It's really fascinating. So I think we're at the end of our time, and yeah, it's been amazing, and there's lots of great discussion. So let's join to thank Anthony.